Welcome to the product Ask Me Anything session. This is day 2, and we had a great time yesterday. For those of you that weren't here yesterday, there is a recording on the Twitter feed for Product AMA, and just to give you a little background, we wanted to start this this product Ask Me Anything so that so that we could have something in our calendars that was scheduled on a daily basis, and that we're passionate about. We want to make sure that the community stays connected and engaged, and have some structure in our daily lives that we could look forward to. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm actually sort of juggling a whole bunch of online meetings, and so I'm happy to take a break and sort of be doing it on a more casual basis. But the format's pretty simple. We basically have an hour, and we'll sort of start off the first half with questions that I'll pose as the host, and then we can turn it over to all of you that are participating, and have a good stretch of time for your questions. And what we'll do going forward is the host of the day will sort of open with some background on the topic for the day, and then introduce our featured expert or speaker. And then the speaker can provide a short perspective on the topic, and then we can get into the Q&A. We'd love to get your questions, so please get on the Twitter feed at Product AMA, Ask Me Anything, and pose your questions there. And as we get going, then obviously we'll address those. And really the idea is to give you the opportunity to ask some things that are relevant to your particular situation, and pick our brains, to learn a few things, and hopefully we'll tell you some entertaining stories and anecdotes. So if you want to get in touch with us, as I said, DM us on Twitter. Give us your feedback or suggestions for future topics or speakers. We're looking to keep this going in a good cadence. So today our topic is customer journey analytics, and joining us to help explain that and connect it to the world of product management is Michael Lieberman, who's the co-founder of Trialfire. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So there's literally dozens of analytics platforms out there, and I'm sure people are using all sorts of different ones to track user behavior and experience. And I assume that almost all of us have some experience with something basic like Google Analytics or Firebase integrated maybe into your digital products. Others may be using things like Pendo or Mixpanel or AppsFlyer, just to name a couple. But before we get into that, Michael, I'm curious to know how you got involved in product management originally, and what led you to analytics in particular.
So I've always been a product guy. I've always liked building things. Been doing it for quite some time. The journey into analytics probably started, well, I mean, it inherently started in everything I was doing in terms of building technology platforms, whether those were websites early on or web applications. The last company that we built previous to Trialfire was a product lifecycle management platform, which is designed to take a product that's being manufactured from inception through to retirement. Any product you can think of, from a computer to a condominium. So kind of long story short, as a startup, we worked, obviously to grow that business, struggled understanding customers, where they were coming from, how we were acquiring them, how they were using our SaaS application. And this is mid-early 2000s, so the struggle was real, as they say. Mm-hmm. We eventually sold that company to Autodesk, spent some time there, so 2 years there, kind of going to market as really a fresh product. And again, those challenges were sort of echoed from what we faced as a small startup. Now we just had that many more developers, but they also did want to, instrument the behavioral tracking and all the other analytics components that were fundamentally required for the business side, for the customer success teams. And people, I don't think, called it customer success back then, but was fundamentally about understanding that individual and how they interacted with us. So after a couple of years at Autodesk, that was sort of the driver to find a solution and a way to address that challenge of instrumenting, analyzing, and reporting on data, and started Trialfire.
Cool.
That was the path to get there.
Yeah.
And to be frank, a lot of the learnings have occurred sort of in situ. You know, things have changed, the market's changed, the tools out there have changed. You know, the marketing landscape diagram, I don't know if everybody's seen or not, but it kind of shows all the different technology vendors and say the marketing technology landscape. You can see how that's grown over the years in terms of the number of players in each quadrant or each section. So a lot of it is as you go, because really, you know, things are getting written each day.
Yeah.
Been exciting, been interesting.
For sure, yeah. No, I think you've seen, like me, you've seen a fair number of changes in kind of the evolution of not only the tools, but also our kind of perspective or process around it too. So yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit. Like, you know, talk to us about your perspective on the overall landscape that, you know, that brands are relying on for day-to-day analytics, and what, you know, what are the sort of key trends or, you know, kind of interesting sort of, you know, changes that you've started to see?
So, I mean, I think to build on sort of what I just said, but even before that, I mean, fundamentally, what are we using any of these tools for? It's sort of to measure the decisions that we're making. So if we're spending money on marketing, how is that working to drive somebody to a property? If we're optimizing a feature or building out a new feature, how does that decision, how do we measure that decision? And then subsequently using a very, you know, scientific method, taking those learnings and you know, going through that approach of figuring out what we can change, modifying it, and then continuing on, all to manage to a set of key metrics. So I kind of start with maybe that par for the course aspect, because, you know, when people think about these analytics tools, a lot of times the thought is really just the, you know, those metrics. I look at a dashboard, but I think there's more to it. But sort of how we got here, to sort of build on that, is very much like I said. I mean, think over the last several years, you know, you can look at 10 years, 5 years, look at the new platforms that are out there in terms of, you know, the technologies. So, you know, obviously mobile is the one that's the biggest new entrant, if you will, from a technology perspective. But then multiple platforms, the marketing channels that are driving people there, the Facebooks and the Googles and so forth. The different marketplaces. There's just so many new pieces thrown into the mix. You know, as I mentioned at the onset, that, you know, there have been products that have been introduced as we've gone along to sort of match those, in many cases point applications to sort to address them. So, you know, when basic web pages first were introduced, I mean, you had your counter at the bottom, 200 people that showed up. I mean, it's obviously it's a nonsense metric, but at that point, really all you could do was show up. So it was a valid metric. More people are coming to the site. But then as we introduced things like, you know, multiple page websites and so forth, where people actually, you know, go in a brochure where it was, okay, well, now we need some web analytics. What pages are they looking? How long are they actually going there? So the metrics got a little bit more sophisticated. The tools had to support that, and that's when you started getting into the urchins, and which eventually became GA, and the Omnichures, Omniture, which eventually became Adobe, and so on. And then further introduction with the mobile world, really behavioral analytics and understanding user behaviors and interactions. And then with the advent and the introduction of more of these digital marketing platforms, obviously digital analytics. And then kind of tying that all together. There's customer analytics, who the actual person is. So you can see how each piece kind of introduced new aspects to that mix of analytics tools in that landscape. And some tools were built out for very specific use cases. So I don't know, you know, pay-per-click analytics tools that are very focused on measuring that particular tactic and so forth. So yes, there's a plethora of tools, and they all you can kind of slot them all in together. But if we're kind of thinking about the customer journey and the experience and so forth, there's still a whole other set of data that people have actually been collecting before just the digital space. And these are data points that go into understanding customer across their journey. So, the CRMs, but maybe we won't even say CRM. Let's call it our email tool. People have been sending emails for a while. And maybe there's, questionnaire tools and NPS tools and measuring customer experience that way, not necessarily by their direct interaction to the site. Never mind the other pieces, which are, the transaction engines like point of sale or even a Shopify, if you will, more in line with kind of the tools now, but also service and support, tickets and things like that. I mean, if we're talking about experience, it's not just, the behaviors in the tool. It's much more. Right. So that's been interesting. That's kind of defines sections of the product analytics or the analytics space. But now you did something that introduced yet another set, which is, okay, now I've got even more silos than before. So then there's a whole layer of other tools that people are using, which kind of are there to bring that together from a silo breakdown perspective, if you will, maybe. That could be as simple as something like a basic dashboard, like a gecko board, which will just pull things together from different systems, just present them one way. There's obviously, big data solutions where, you're pushing data out, aggregating it, and, using tools like Tableau and other business intelligence layers on top of that. So that's another section of the marketplace or the landscape. And I think some of the things that are interesting and new, and, there's obviously some hype, but some reality to a lot of it is some of the AI machine learning. So some of the additional layers that sit on top of all of that, which is about making sense of it. But if I kind of take that all together and break up that marketplace in a different way, I would kind of break it into three pieces, which kind of align to how you get ROI out of analytics in general. So one is the collection. So how do we get the data we need for analysis? Because a priori, you don't have the data, there's nothing to analyze. So analytics don't exist without the data. The second is the reporting. So the basic types of, these are the metrics, these are the KPIs that we're measuring against. We need to have access to them. But the third piece, and the piece that is really the most valuable in terms of the type of return and the insights it provides, is the analysis. So the tools available to go in there and dig. And those could be as simple as, or not as simple, but as rudimentary as your, an analyst in SQL, to somebody leveraging, a mixed panel to build a funnel, or, a marketing attribution solution that does some machine learning or AI to analyze all the customer marketing touch points and so forth. So, again, at the collection side, which I kind of skipped through how maybe, or some of the pieces there, that's your tag managers, it's the pixels that people are putting on their site. That's, the API, the advent of all these APIs, the different tools to get data from different sources. Obviously JavaScript trackers. And I think it's important to know from the collection through reporting analysis, some of the tools do most of that, but some are really focused on one part. So, one of the well-known entities in the space is, say, Segment. They've evolved quite a bit, but initially it was a wrapper for, data collection API. So they would play more in that space. Splunk is a tool that a lot of product folks are using for analysis, sort of on the log file level. So there's a lot of data. There's tools that focus more on that. There's tools that focus on the reporting, be it, the Tableaus and the dashboards. Again, some on the dashboard level might be as simple as sort of a bare metrics that sits on top of Stripe to see that, just to give you a better way to look at the transactions that are happening. But then all the way through to more sophisticated, business intelligence platforms, Tableaus and Domos and so forth.
Right. So let's, I would imagine that most folks, sort of approach analytics from the standpoint of, okay, let's get a whole bunch of data and then we'll figure out what makes sense. But there's also, a lot of discussion around KPIs and dashboards for product. My colleague Saeed Khan talks a lot about, how to approach metrics and analytics for product. And he really points out that you need to start with a question, right? What is your question, and what kind of data do you need to answer that question? What's your thought on that versus kind of, just capturing all the data you possibly can and then figuring out what makes sense?
So, I mean, I think there's kind of two ways I look at that question. Trialfire, our company, Keep, some others, the data collection strategy is collect it all, right? That's one part. So there's that aspect of the strategy, because at one point you might not know what questions you want to ask. That's let's put that on the side for a second. But I agree with that point entirely, in that when I talk to people, the fundamental question is, what's the move metric? What are you fundamentally trying to move in the business? And I think that's entirely relevant on what you're offering, and then also things to be considered are what do you actually have the influence over. So if it's a product analytic, if it's, say, a question to start with from a product rollout, if I'm building, let's say, a tool for internal consumption at a large org, the moon metric will be different. It might be, that they can actually get done what they're required. They have to use the tool. It's neither here nor there. And another one, like the famous Facebook example, it's fundamentally, we need to get people engaged. And then using data, to your point before, what is indicative of engagement? How can we mine this data to understand who's more engaged? And then again, you're starting with a question, you're measuring it, and then you have to act in order to move that number. Otherwise, it's all for naught, right? Because it kind of goes to that point of collect everything and do nothing with it is it's a waste of everybody's time and effort. So you're fundamentally have a question, but the question has to be in line with what are you trying to achieve or move. We were talking about marketplaces yesterday. In that marketplace, what are you fundamentally driving? I mean, let's say you've got all the suppliers into the marketplace. Well, you're trying to grow the front end side of that. So where are the buyers? How do we get the buyers? How do we make sure the buyers sign up? If we're trying to drive growth from a product perspective, there are mechanisms in terms of engineering that we can use for aspects of the customer journey, the awareness side. So all of those tactics like referrals. And it's a marketing tactic, it's an awareness tactic, but it's fundamentally an engineering effort, right? You build it in, you build referral codes, all that. It's the product folks that are responsible for building that out. So again, if you start with the idea of what are you fundamentally trying to achieve, then you can measure against it and then implement against that.
Right. So let's talk about the customer journey a little. And I guess it sort of riffs off the last question, which is, do you start by focusing on what are the data points that you need to help you understand both the journey and the experience, positive or negative, right? So talk a little bit about how you define the customer journey, and what are the sort of important things that people should be focusing on there first for tracking from a product management perspective.
So, I mean, my view of the customer journey, it's obviously related to the type of offering that we provide. But again, even before that, I don't think the customer journey is something new. I mean, companies have for years been prescribing or trying to identify what is the customer journey. What does it look like for somebody saying, I don't know, pair of Air Jordans on Michael Jordan, and then going into Foot Locker, but mapping out what they think that journey is, and then somewhat measuring against it. So that's not new in that marketing or the broader sense of measuring awareness to the interest decision. Glenn Ross has made famous. From a product management side, the same thing kind of applies in that when we start with developing user stories and pass through to a platform, how it's that same idea. So, there's always been this idea of trying to map out and figure out what that looks like. So I think that's one part of it. so that it's not a new concept. What's interesting nowadays, especially when things are more digital, is we can validate that pretty quickly. So, I mean, if you're building out a product and you say, okay, this is the flow through it, this is what we think it is, this is how we built it, and then realize that, you know, the analytics are showing something entirely different, then you were wrong and you fix it. Right. From a more macro perspective, though, you might look at things like, you know, how do we acquire these people? How do they get in? What are the cohorts that are going through these feature developments and so forth? And you know, using many more touch points that don't necessarily just exist in the product. I know we're kind of narrowing into product management and rolling out a digital or other product, but the customer journey doesn't just focus on that. Right. So I think it focuses on really how I kind of define the product journey is, you know, those marketing or advertising or referral tactics that introduce somebody to a brand, through to all the different interactions with them, how they visit the site, stores potentially, you know, obviously the omnichannel aspect, through the experience of the site. So let's say, for example, it's an e-commerce site. I mean, that shopping experience is, you know, parallels using an app to get some kind of value out of it and to convert through it. So I tend to look at all of it, including, you know, the post-purchase, if you will, so the engagement. Maybe I signed up for an app, I got to use it still, or I'm going to get rid of it. So that's actually something that's interesting because it aligns a little bit with the product lifecycle management work we did in the past around the product. This has to do with a customer's interaction. And obviously there's data points that exist in different places. And I think in application, you kind of see it. So I have a use case or an example that I'll share. Maybe helps kind of. It's a pretty big concept, but you can kind of see how we baked stuff together to sort of explain it better. Okay. We did a project with a company that runs a tax application. So you go in, you do your tax return, you file it. Great. There's not that many, but you can probably figure out who it is. So the initial point was to understand, you know, very much from the product management group, you know, where are people getting stuck? How do we, you know, optimize that experience so that they eventually continue through? And that's a very narrow part of the customer experience. Then we kind of looked at, okay, well, that's one part of it. How are different cohorts going through that from a marketing perspective? We didn't have that visibility. So now we started working on the marketing side. So that you see how the customer journey or the experience in the platform is just part of it, but they're interconnected. And then even to build on that, so, you know, you asked about some of the tracking or what should I do. Now let's throw in some of the questions that were asked or discussed before then. What's stopping people from getting through? And there's another set of data that is part of the customer journey but wasn't thought about, which is help and support. So if I'm going through a particular process and I keep jumping to help, can I use that to understand the behavior of a person and how to better influence their journey? These are things that, you know, as we look right in the product, especially in developing products, we don't necessarily factor in sort of these ancillary touch points that people have. How many tickets do they have, you know, for customer support and so forth. So then we bake that in, and we could understand and even project or predict certain people that might not make it all the way through the funnel because, hey, they keep going to this particular help file. And if they do, we know they're not going to get to the end. So that was one question 1 year. And another example, and I guess I'm trying to tie this not to so much to what we should be tracking, but back to the point before about what's the objective or what's a goal or what's a question. Then there was, this was a freemium service. So you did your tax application, they're great, you submitted it, made no money and it cost them a lot. The goal was obviously to always monetize that. And I think this applies to people that are building freemium products or free trials and so forth. And the idea there was initially how that project worked was they'd go to the end of that process, submit their tax return, be offered a number of different options in terms of, do you want us to review this? Do you want us to archive this? Do you want us to do X with this? And then using that behavioral data and looking at that customer journey, we were able to start trying putting up paywalls at different points. So if we knew they were going to certain help files and struggling, or they, had filled in a certain field or form or whatever criteria, then introduce paywalls at that point. So the idea is you are building a better experience. You're making sure people are getting through it by understanding. But you can see how there are different pieces that aren't necessarily just that product that a PM might be narrowly focused on, that affect the customer journey and that are part of the overall customer journey. Right. So back to that point about tracking, I still get into what does it make sense to track is track everything from my technology perspective, but where to focus, what to put on those reports. Death by dashboard is a real thing. How do you focus on that move metric and those underlying metrics that help drive that?
Right, right. Cool. You mentioned a little while ago Omnichannel, and I'm wondering if you have maybe an example or some thoughts on product people who are looking at an omnichannel experience. So, we know that there's a lot of work going on at Loblaws Digital or Walmart Labs, or a variety of the banks have, big teams. Like, how do you approach that bringing together of the data from an omnichannel experience?
So in some cases, the largest of the large organizations have the opportunity to sometimes leverage some of their loyalty tools and so forth. I mean, Amazon does this obviously quite well. In the personal experience of going to a Whole Foods on Prime Day. They give you the coupon, they make you log in. I put in the coupon while I'm there. I'm able to start stitching my journey together. There's other mechanisms to do that as well, but I think fundamentally what it ends up boiling down to is ways to merge that data together. I mean, there's always been this, the ideal of big data and what that meant. I mean, I think that's so 2014, if you will. Conceptually makes. I mean, you want to stitch all this together. You want to stitch the different data points you have about people together. It's challenging. There are different ways and approaches to handle that. Some cases it's much easier. For example, I'll give you an example for our world of how we address sort of that challenge. We work with an OEM automotive manufacturer. People went onto their web property to build out the vehicles that they were interested in, and we obviously tracked and knew who that individual was, and we can analyze all that kind of stuff. But then they went into a store and bought something. So the question ends up being, how do I stitch that offline back to the digital experience? Right. And I mean, we have a couple different mechanisms in terms of our technology that allows us to do that. It's not, unless you have two data sets with the same key in each one, and you can perfectly stitch them together, you're never going to get 100%. But we were able to do that at a substantial amount because their move metric or their objective was to understand the influence of that on-site or online experience to actual transactions. So again, once that was stitched together, they could analyze things like if somebody builds out a Golf and add so many options to it, are they likely to buy a Jetta because they've already moved up to a tier? Or looking at their different touch points in terms of digital marketing, how long before they actually transact it in store? What's the percentage of those? So you get into attribution, some of those questions.
And would you say that the thing that stitches it together or is kind of the foundation is that customer journey and kind of our ever evolving understanding of it?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, those are all pieces of the customer journey. In some cases, we don't have visibility. For example, part of the customer journey is the research I do on, a third-party website or competitor site. I don't have visibility into that, and a brand will never have that. But the different touch points that are own data sets, you can stitch that together. In some cases, they're, again, to something like a Walmart or a Loblaws, you might have the opportunity to do some reconciling based on, credit card data, for example. So there's other methods that might be available to certain organizations. But let's talk about most of the people that would probably be focused on this challenge from a product perspective, less on an aggregate marketing perspective. It's being able to tie identities together in different places. I mean, that's fundamentally the objective of stitching the customer journey together. You get the identity, you see all the things that person does from, you know, behavioral and a transactional and marketing touch point perspective. Stitch that together so you can understand the audience and break it down and build funnels and all that kind of stuff with a holistic view. And you know, also associated with that omnichannel perspective, it doesn't necessarily have to be as omnichannel, if you will, and as I kind of alluded to. It's just stitching together devices. I mean, even that's a challenge for a lot of organizations. Anything that's in an anonymous world could potentially be very difficult to stitch that together. So sometimes it's those kinds of things before the more sophisticated.
Yeah, that's great. You know, Michael, let's sort of go to the next step, which is we want to talk about some of the tools, but before we do that, what are kind of the big inflection points or changes, like dramatic, if there are, revolutions in the analytics sort of market over the time you guys have been involved in it?
Again, I think it's more maybe the sources of where data is coming from, the pieces that you can almost stitch together. I mean, the concept of microservices and little components and third-party pieces that you can kind of stitch together and leverage. Things like Stripe that are being built into tools. So, you know, there's all these other tools that are almost packaged services that you can use. I think that's something that we've seen grow. But fundamentally, the biggest thing that I've seen has actually been a driver in terms of some of the work that we've done, which is the advent of all these different marketing channels and tactics and the challenge of attribution. So, I mean, I think before we started, we talked a little bit about how when we started Trialfire, we were heavily focused in the behavioral side of analytics, which we still are. But one of the things that organizations, whether they were using our tools from behavioral side of things or from a marketing side of things, really struggle with marketing attribution. I still think that's something that's not perfectly solved in terms of all the options out there. And it's not perfectly solved in the sense that people still haven't thought about the fact that it's not just about the technology. So what do I mean by that? You've got more things to measure, and a lot of that is complicated. Okay, so what we've seen in a lot of cases is sort of this sticking to the vanity aspect or vanity metrics, if you will. It's changed a lot in the behavioral side of things. People understand that, you know, I did this, then I did this, then I did that. I mean, we're measuring funnels, cohorts, and so forth. From a marketing perspective, that hasn't changed. So maybe that's the inverse of your question, in that, you know, people are still using from an attribution perspective, last click. And just to give you the quick on that for those who aren't familiar, I see an ad, I click on it, I go to the site, and I download the app or I buy something. I'm going to give credit to that particular ad, that last touch point. In reality, it usually takes a lot of different touch points. So, you know, again, there's social ads now, there's remarketing, there's pay-per-click, there's display ads, there's a whole bunch of different ways that people find out about your brand, your app, your e-commerce shop. And the question is, how do you actually make sense of that? So, I mean, we've taken a particular approach to assign credit to those touch points. I still think that people, and aligned with that, are still focused on doing things either very simply, so that last click is just a simple way to address this problem, or they don't trust in something that they maybe aren't 100% sure how it works. And that kind of alludes more to the the AI and machine learning and algorithms, black box algorithms specifically. So just the point is, our approach is not a black box model for doing marketing attribution. We don't need to dig into that too much, but the kind of why I was going this way is that, you know, we've seen people embrace the idea of tools that go in and kind of give them the answers, but then still not trust those. And if they haven't, you know, fundamentally set up that question, they're uncertain as to how much to trust the machine or the model, because it's a model. I mean, if we're talking about models, you can see how fluid models are just by watching the news now, in terms of, you know, the inputs in your models, you know, the growth rates, etc. So that's still something that we're seeing. Obviously, more and more people leverage that, but how they're actually utilizing it and implementing against it. So they might have a tool that does auto buying of keywords, for example, that rely obviously on analytics to drive that, but then not trusting the automation side of it. Those are things that that we've kind of seen. You know, it's funny because I was talking to a colleague who works with an email marketing platform, and you know, the platform suggests these are the times to have these emails sent out, and a lot of, you know, folks still kind of ignore that because they're not necessarily they don't necessarily believe that, right or wrong. I mean, there's a mix of people, but these are, I think, some of the interesting things in growth, but also the challenges. You know, moving forward with some of this new technology out there.
So I would imagine that, you know, from a product management perspective, one of the other big changes, of course, in our approach to analytics has been the whole lean movement, and that, you know, that iterative approach to product design and development does depend on feedback and validation through analytics. Have you seen that too? No?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, we've rolled out Trialfire sort of in that model. Again, you know, my background's always kind of been approached this from a product perspective. We built a piece, put it out there. I mean, I know there's different conversations on what an MVP means, but you know, putting something out there that actually delivers value, measuring that, deciding what the next step is based on that feedback. Does it have uptick? Does it, you know, are people using the pieces that we think are relevant? You know, some of that is definitely the analytics. Some of it is customer questionnaires. I mean, there's more to it than just, you know, looking at the data in some cases. And in some cases, you're just thinking ahead also. But I think that definitely informs, I mean, that informs all the approaches that we take. So, if, you know, you're running marketing campaigns, people don't run marketing campaigns for the year necessarily anymore, or they might, but, you know, you don't have to, you know, create a TV ad and then run it all year. You can literally change your marketing to suit tomorrow's, you know, disaster, not to bring that up, but that ability to make decisions quickly. Again, some of it is, you make the decision to figure out if it worked or not, to figure out if you should do it again. Sometimes you don't have the data to determine it. You don't necessarily start always with the data, but you know, from the beginning point, I think you want to make sure that you're approaching marketing from that perspective of, we're measuring something to figure out if that decision made sense or not, and then we're going to change it if it didn't. Because again, if you know, you've got this data set or this insight and you're not doing anything, then there's no point in having it.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess,
and sometimes you have to shake it up just to see if that increased or decreased. I mean, that's kind of the concept behind A/B testing.
Sure. And so another, you know, potentially interesting change has been the ability to more easily collect real-time data too, and make you know, decisions on a more flexible basis, right? So like you mentioned with marketing automation, you know, 15 years ago, we didn't have the ability to see people's behavior in real time and be able to say, okay, tomorrow we're going to change the, you know, the campaign or something like that. But now we can. And so, by extension, you take that back into the product, creation and development process. And you're also able to run more iterative small experiments, get some data on that, and be able to adjust quite quickly, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also drive things like personalization and so forth.
Right.
I mean, there's decisions on what to build. There's aspects of the platform and the way that it serves content or the experience based on tailoring it. There's always been the pick my preferences. The more intuitive that can be, I'm using that more for the experience, the argument for delivering a greater experience to someone.
Because so Lee, we got a couple of questions in on Twitter.
Shoot.
So why don't I'll ask the first one. And,
please do. Go
it's
for
from
it.
Joelle, and she's asking about the number of touch points, the ideal number of touch points that you should be looking at to measure how a customer moves up and down the funnel. And Joelle, as Michael gives his answer, you can you're free to chime in to ask him to elaborate.
So, I mean, I think the question was the ideal number of touch points. I don't think there is an ideal number of touch points. Let me kind of step back and kind of talk through my answers to this. You don't necessarily know what the touch points are to get somebody to convert, meaning, it depends on the kind of offering. So let's say I'm selling a car, that's going to be a certain number of touch points over 3 to 6 to 9 months potentially. Or I'm selling, a consumer product, which might be 6 visits in the period of a month. Those visits and those touch points could include obviously remarketing and social remarketing and initial pay-per-click and email and so forth. I guess my point there is that fundamentally you're measuring what the average number of touch points is. How long from that first visit on average until conversion, to get a baseline for that particular organization or that business. And then from there, building on that to say, well, what happens if we add another remarketing step? What happens if we extend the remarketing step, the remarketing touch points an extra 3 months? It's again, I think you're kind of building the baseline, understanding what it really takes for your kind of organization or business, and then optimizing against that by testing. And again, there's obviously many factors in there. They're kind of creative, the time frame, and those are all things that you want to factor in. So I'm not sure if that kind of answers your question on the number of touch points, or if it was about which touch points to measure. That might be a different question. So just let me know if that's kind of how you want me to answer the question.
Hey, thanks for answering that, Michael. That's helpful. I know definitely, just in my experience that conversion can happen with 1 touch point. It can happen with 5. It's very hard to measure sometimes when you don't know how many offline touch points they've had or seen. I think, and you made a great point about MailChimp too, and how to optimize a particular customer group. So I guess the next caveat to the question is, how do you group these customers into a particular segment that that maybe are warmer or colder or need some more attention or more touch points in that sense? Like, what attributes, or where do you start to create those attributes?
So that's an interesting question, because again, I think the touch points are about sort of what drove somebody to the site. And sort of understanding how those pieces play to get somebody through a funnel or a piece of a funnel, micro, macro. I think the next part, or the part that you kind of got into, is breaking into really building out customer segments. So what defines somebody that's in segment A through N, for example? And again, it depends on the kind of organization and the kind of offering that you're providing. So let's do something like for the product development folks, the product management side, those are, engagement, number of logins per day, the functionality that they're using, potentially put them in a certain cohort. or in a certain segment. For, let's say, an e-commerce brand, it might be recency, frequency, monetary value to put them in segments. So you're using all the behaviors that you've collected about those individuals, and you're defining what is indicative of one that correlates to conversion. I don't know necessarily that the marketing touch points themselves are indicative of somebody who's more likely to convert, although we know that things like remarketing visits generally convert more because they're already aware now we're bringing them back. But if it's a question of segmenting people from the perspective of their value, again, it's usually done in some kind of a framework of, maybe it's recency, frequency, monetary value in an e-commerce space where we saw them in the last 10 days. They've spent over $1 billion with us, and they spend that $1 billion once a month. So that's someone. If you're getting into somebody that's not yet purchased and you're trying to understand where they are, again, I think there's certain behaviors that they would exhibit to help us understand how close they are to a conversion event. And if we know that they've visited 5 times, maybe that's one of the inputs in there. But again, you're asking a very complex question, and this goes into, I think, even a bigger issue in terms of analytics overall, which is analytics are great, but the main area where it becomes or where the bottleneck is or the challenges is people and process, right? You're asking sophisticated questions. Nothing just gives you that answer because, again, things are different. So even if you tracked everything, even if you knew exactly all the details, it's fundamentally about thinking about what are the questions I need to ask. And yours is probably more sophisticated than some of the other topics within a product or within a customer experience. Then how to formulate those questions and then how to extract that. So assuming we've collected all the data points necessary to answer those questions.
All right, thanks, Michael. Thanks, Joel. Michael, there's a couple other questions, a few of them from Alicia, so maybe I'll pick one, see how much we have time for. So Alicia is asking around data points. So what are the 3 main data points to look for that are most valuable and can influence a change? And I guess you can generalize this answer, and Alicia, as Michael answers, you can feel free to chime in to get him to clarify as well.
So the 3 most important data points to affect a change or upon which to make the decision to make that change.
Well, why don't you answer the question that makes most sense to the business that you're running, and Alicia can clarify as you go.
Right. So I mean, I get that. It's again, I'm trying to make it generic. So let's say we had a desired outcome. In essence, I would measure the results, if that is performing at a certain baseline, and then, modify based on what the expectation is. So if I had a hypothesis that putting this particular pop-up window that lets somebody invite 20 friends, is the way that we're going to grow the referral aspect of this solution. So I do that. I mean, I'm starting sort of with the perspective of I'm going to do something and figure out if it worked or not. So that's actually starting from an objective is an easier way to think about it, in that I've done something. Now I get to measure it. So is it 1 data point? Is it 3 data points? So at a minimum, there's sort of a time series aspect to it. So, I pop it up. Is the use of that at all what we expect or reasonable to achieve that goal of maybe growing the referral relationships by 100 times, right? So I'm looking to that move metric, and then I'm making my decision if am I going to get there based on what I'm trying to do. The other is to see obviously how that's trending. So that's kind of the time series aspect. But the other part is that I can make changes to see if different iterations of that or different versions of that or different presentations of that might result in that desired outcome. I don't know if I'm answering the question exactly on, but I think the challenge is the way to measure if something has worked or not is fundamentally unique depending on what we're trying to achieve. If I were to maybe take that a different way and say, what are the 3 points about a person that we want to collect or understand? Well, I mean, I think we definitely want to collect data points on who that person is, meaning, get an email address or some kind of identifier, because that's how we're going to stitch things together. And then it's all of their behaviors to determine later which question is relevant so that we have it. And then the transactions or the desired activities that we want to see that they perform. Because then we can step back and do things like figure out, well, are there any correlation between certain behaviors and that outcome? If we change something, did the outcome change? It's fundamentally about measuring what you're doing as opposed to saying these are, I think, the 3 things that are key to understanding if what you're doing are working. You're sort of answering the data points after making the decision on what it is you're trying to achieve.
Great. And can we go back to what you originally, or when you clarified the question, was what are the data points that I should look for in Trialfire, for example, or even Google Analytics that can influence a change that maybe like I want to bring to, as a product manager, I want to bring this to attention of Silver, for example, or an executive vice president or something like that, and say, hey, from Trialfire, from Google Analytics, here are the key 3 data points that we want to see grow, and like what are those data points?
So I mean, again, having let's say you had a platform that was all about delivering content. So you see, I'm already framing how I would potentially answer those questions for you. So this is what I'm doing. I have a platform that's caught content, and it's whatever kind of content. And then what am I trying to validate? Fundamentally, I want people to consume that content. I want them to consume more of it. So at a minimum, that's when things like engagement metrics come in. So are people spending more time on site? I'm getting into some of these generic metrics that would apply. So are they spending more time looking at my content? What's the breadth of content? They're looking at more pieces of content. They're coming to visit to look at my content once every day, and somebody who came today will come back tomorrow and the next day. Those are 3 examples just from an engagement perspective. But again, within that, if you wanted to get more specific, it's, and sorry, you had a discrete activity that you wanted from someone to do, for example, signing up to receive that email, then I would look at it at, here are the people that are visiting, here's, how engaged they are, and here's the percentage that are signing up for the newsletter, for example. So that conversion event, and those are behaviors. So that I basically create a funnel to see that that's working, and hopefully, prove somehow that that's trending up and right.
Great.
Does that answer your question, Alicia?
I think so. And then if I could just build off of Joelle's question there, how long on average, I know each kind of company or business is slightly different, how long does it take to kind of really get that baseline of your customers before you move them into the funnel?
So again, it depends, like you said, on the kind of experience that person's having. So usually it's actually relatively quick, right? If I'm measuring a baseline metric, like let's just stay at a vanity metric, just traffic or volume from a content perspective, is within a week, assuming that it's not something that's that really fluctuates by month, you probably have enough of a baseline to see if the next day or the next month or the next week that's going up or not. So that's kind of one level from the baseline. But as you get to more sophisticated questions, that baseline might need more data. So for example, to kind of build on what you and Joelle have been asking, if you're trying to attribute your marketing to the different touch points, and I have a week of data, but my buying cycle is a month, obviously I'm not even close to having enough data to say that these are the touch points that lead into conversion. So let's say I have a month. Is that enough? Well, some of those journeys start before the month, some of them start halfway through. I'm getting closer. So let's say 2 months, 3 months, you're going to sort of hit an asymptote to get to that baseline, and that'll change. But think about, and to be honest with you, I don't have the perfect answer to say this is how long it's going to take, especially from an attribution perspective. But if you've got enough journeys in there that it's already statistically significant, it's not 3 conversions over those 6 months, then you're starting to get into some data that you can make decisions on. And again, I think what's important with all of this is that the answers come from your interpretation. You can interpret things wrong even. You can interpret them right. But this is the data that's informing you. You still need to think about it. You still need to make sure that you're asking the questions fairly, maybe correctly is too strong a word, but fairly, and understanding that data's got some aspect of that picture, and there's also some thinking and your experience, and there's sort of the domain experience that always comes with the data, and you got to tie those pieces together. Because data in a vacuum doesn't necessarily help me answer a question if I have no idea about the business.
Michael, thank you so much. We're just about out of time, and I think there's a ton more questions. Certainly, a few that I have. And I think, Mark, there may have been a couple of more questions, so we'll try to answer those on the Twitter feed at Product AMA. So if you didn't get your question answered, then check there, and we'll see if we can follow up. Michael, thank you again so much for doing this. It's been really a pleasure to hear your insights on this. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. Please share any of your feedback, or if you have topic ideas, DM us on the Twitter feed at Product AMA. And then our next session will be next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, when we talk with Jonah Morris from the Huge Agency. And he's going to talk about how agencies support clients with digital transformation. And he'll be talking about some of his experiences supporting the transformation at Longos. So that should be quite interesting. So thanks again, everybody. Stay healthy and follow us on Twitter. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll look forward to talking to you again on Tuesday. Bye for now.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody.